Well, good evening, everyone. We'll be studying in Genesis chapter 31 tonight, if you'll be finding that in your Bible, starting about verse 14. We've been traveling in this book of Genesis. Genesis is a very interesting book. I've taught most of it. I never have got to finish it. Every time I've started it, I get to a place to where the Lord leads me somewhere else, or something happens that I don't ever get to finish it. But the story picks up as Jacob has been in Haran for 20 years now. He went there with nothing. Now he has 4 wives, a house full of kids that are, most of them are pretty well grown, and at least older teenagers. And God had spoken to him and said, I am the God of Bethel, where you anointed the pillar, where you vowed a vow. Get up, go from this land, and go back home. I'm paraphrasing that. And in verse 14, it says, And Rachel and Leah answered and said unto him, Is there yet any portion of inheritance for us in our father's house? Now he had went to his wives and told them what God had said to him. And their answer, and it's amazing what they said. These women, as far as we know, they had never been anywhere. Probably been right there in that one spot all their life. Because if you traveled in those days, you either rode a camel or a donkey or walked. And it appears that they hadn't really been anywhere. Their father Laban, this is his homeland. This is where Sarah was raised, in this area, and Abraham. And when he comes and tells them what the Lord has told him to do, you would think that they would say, well, I don't want to leave. I don't want to go anywhere. I remember back in 1982, Francis and I and our 2 kids were up at Carson Newman College for the preacher's school in the summer of 1982. And just the Lord woke me up one morning about 4 o'clock and said, I want you in Michigan to pastor a church. And I told Frances about it, and to be honest with you, she wasn't excited about going. Her mother had just died that year. And my mother was in a nursing home. Her dad had a stroke, and he needed people to help take care of him. Our daughter was engaged to be married. So it was a big thing. Our son was about 11 years old at that time. And I told the Lord, I said, I'm not going unless my wife goes with me. Well, it took almost a year, but the Lord convinced her that that's where we needed to be. And one morning I was walking through the house, and she said, do you still sense that we need to move to Michigan? I said, more so than ever. And she said, well, I'm not anxious to go, but I'm willing. Now, I suppose these women would have acted like that, but they didn't. They said, is there yet any portion or inheritance for us in our father's house? They had a reason for saying that. Verse 15, are we not counted of him as strangers Evidently, he didn't come to see them very much. They just felt like strangers there in their own hometown. He has sold us and has quite devoured also our money. Now, I was reading a commentary today, and the commentator made a point out of that word, that phrase, he has sold us. And he says it comes from the same word that is translated prostitute in other places in the Old Testament. He has prostituted us. He got rich off of us. Because you see, Jacob had worked for him for 20 years. 14 of those years to pay for his wives, and 6 years to pay for the flocks that he had. And Laban had very little when he went there, but Laban was a wealthy man by now. And it was through Jacob that he became wealthy, because Jacob took good care of his sheep and his cattle, and God blessed. Look at verse 16. For all the riches which God has taken from our father. Now remember, we studied here last week that it was said that God had took it away from Laban, not Joseph. The riches which God has taken from our father. These young ladies had come to realize that Jacob served a different God than their dad did. And God had taken from our father, that is ours. They said, really, what we've got through you, Jacob, should have been our inheritance to begin with. He has sold us and has quite devoured also our money. For all the riches which God has taken from our father, that is ours, and our children's. Now then, whatsoever God has said unto thee, do. Now here's at least two of those wives. The other two were kind of counted as slaves, I suppose, and they probably didn't have a say in it. But Rachel and Leah are the daughters of Laban. The other two wives were just handmaidens. And these ladies were in line to get an inheritance from their father. And they look at what God has given to Jacob that has come from their father, that this was God's way of blessing them with an inheritance. And they've come to realize that you can trust God. And they said, whatever God said to you, do it. Now that's a good thing. I've told people that down through the years. I've had people to come to me and say, Pastor, we had to tell you this, but says, the Lord is leading us to another church. And if I hear that the Lord is leading us, I say, well, if God's leading you, that's where you need to be. Go. I don't want to stand in God's way, and I know God does move people around from time to time, and he uses them in different places and different ways. Then Jacob rose up and set his sons and his wives upon camels. Now, he's come to the place now where he's wealthy enough he owns some camels. That camel's supposed to showed up last week out here. I don't know how much it's worth, but they're quite expensive. He rose up, put his wife and his sons upon camels. So how many camels did he have at least? If one person rode a camel. 17 at least. 17, okay. That's a lot of camels, isn't it? He carried away all his cattle and all his goods which he had gotten. The cattle of his getting which he had gotten in Padan Aram, for to go to Isaac his father in the land of Canaan. Does anybody remember how far it was from Canaan to Padan Aram? We studied that some time back. 350, 400 miles, something like that, wasn't it? Yeah. A long ways to travel on a camel. But they go. They do not tell Laban about this. He's going home to the land of Canaan. Verse 19, and Laban went to shear his sheep. And notice what happens. His daughter Rachel stole the images that were her father's. These are some kind of idols, idol gods that he had. She stole them. One commentator said, well, it's probably something she'd saw in their home all of her life, and she wanted to take a memento with her. I don't think so. She knew that her dad worshiped these idols. Was she trying to get him to turn to God? I don't know. But anyway, she takes them. And Jacob stole away unaware to Laban the Syrian, in that he told him not that he fled. So he fled with all he had. He rose up and passed over the river, the Euphrates River, and set his face toward Mount Gilead. Now, how many of you have been to the Holy Land? You remember when you was on the Sea of Galilee and you looked out there and you saw that big mountain that just rose up? That's Mount Gilead. Now, out in the desert, you can see a long ways. There's not a lot of hills in the desert. So evidently he could see that mountain, and that was his marker. He wanted to travel there. That's the way you do it when you don't have roads and things. You set your eye on something and go to it. You ever plow corn that way? Start looking down at the plow and you'll plow up all the corn. But you keep your eye on a target out there and you can go right to it. But it was told Laban on the third day that Jacob was fled. Now 3 days passed before Laban found this out. I don't know how far they traveled in 3 days, but remember they had the cattle and all these kind of things, and you can't travel as fast with them as you can on foot, just going like Jacob did when he came over there, just walking. So 3 days have passed. One commentator said it was probably about 60 miles that they had made in those 3 days. That would have been 20 miles a day. He took his brethren with him and pursued after him 7 days' journey. So it took Laban a week to catch up because Jacob and his family kept moving. So 7 days, 4 more days after they had gone. Took his brethren with him and pursued after him 7 days' journey, and they overtook him in Mount Gilead. He was back in the territory of the Israelis at this time, Mount Gilead. But notice what happens. God is on the scene here. God knows what Laban has in mind. He's going out there, and I'll just guarantee you he was mad as an old wet hen when he come one day and all of his daughters and their servants and all the cattle and all the sheep and all the goats and all those things are gone. God came to Laban the Syrian in a dream by night and said unto him, Take heed that thou speak not to Jacob either good or bad. There's people today that doubt that God speaks to people. But as you read your Bible, just underline some of those times when God speaks to people. And this is one of them. Laban was not a follower of the same God that Jacob followed. Laban was an idolater, worshipped idol gods. But God, Jehovah God, in a dream by night, spoke to him, said, "Take heed that thou speak not to Jacob either good or bad." That tells me that Laban was about to go and say some things he shouldn't say. And God tells him, don't you speak either good or bad to him. Then Laban overtook Jacob. Now Jacob had pitched his tent in the mount, and Laban with his brethren pitched in the mount of Gilead. And Laban said to Jacob, "What hast thou done, that thou hast stolen away unawares unto me, and carried away my daughters as captives, taken with a sword?" What have you done? What are you doing, taking my daughters like this? You've stolen them unaware to me. Wherefore didst thou flee away secretly? Why didn't you tell me you wanted to go? Why did you flee away secretly and steal away from me, and did not tell me, that I might have sent thee away with mirth and with songs, with tabret and with harp? If you'd have told me, we'd just had a big party, a going away party. And that's what Laban's saying. I doubt that he would have celebrated that way. Verse 28, "And hast not suffered me to kiss my sons and my daughters. Thou hast now done foolishly in so doing." Jacob, this is a foolish thing you've done. You should know I would want to kiss my daughters and my grandchildren goodbye. You've done foolishly. It is in the power of my hand to do you hurt. I don't know how many people he had with him. But he takes it upon himself to say that he could hurt Jacob. "But the God of your father," now notice how he phrases this, "the God of your father," not the God of my father, "the God of your father spoken to me yesternight, saying, Take thou heed that thou speak not to Jacob either good or bad." He listened to what God had to say. Can God still get the attention of a lost person? He sure can. He got my attention when I was lost. He got your attention when you were lost. God's not limited in who he can speak to. Verse 30, "And now, though thou wouldst needs be gone, because thou sore longest after thy father's house, yet wherefore hast thou stolen my gods?" Jacob, I know you want to go home. I know you long to see your family. You've been here a long time. But I just have a question for you. Why did you steal my gods? I'm glad I've got a God nobody can steal. But people that worship these things like that, earthly things, you can lose them. Then what's happened to you, God? Verse 31, "Jacob answered and said to Laban, Because I was afraid." We slipped out because I was afraid. For I said, peradventure, or perhaps, thou wouldst take by force thy daughters from me. I know you're a powerful man, Laban, and I was afraid. I was afraid you would take your daughters away from me. With whomsoever thou findest thy gods. Now let's address the thing that Laban is really upset about. With whomsoever thou findest thy gods, let him not live. Now Jacob didn't know anything about this, about Rachel and what she had done. Whomsoever thou findest thy gods, let him not live before our brethren. Discern thou what is thine with me, and take it to thee. For Jacob knew not that Rachel had stolen them. You go and search. If you find your gods, you let me know who has them. He was in the dark about his wife. Laban went into Jacob's tent. That's the first place he searched, Jacob's tent, to make sure Jacob hadn't taken them. And then into Leah's tent. And then into the two maidservants' tents. He found them not. Then went he out of Leah's tent and entered into Rachel's tent. Now Rachel happened to be in the tent. Notice what happens here, verse 34. Now Rachel had taken the images, or the idols, and put them in the camel's furniture, probably the saddlebags of the camel. And she sat upon them. She's sitting on that saddle. And Laban searched all the tent, but found him not. And Rachel said to her father, let it not displease my lord, that I cannot rise up before thee, for the custom of women is upon me. And he searched, but found not the images. Rachel made up an excuse that she couldn't stand that. But he searched, but he didn't search in the right places. She was sitting on those. And Jacob was wroth, or angry, and he chode with Laban. And Jacob answered and said to Laban, what is my trespass? What is my sin, that thou hast so hotly pursued after me? Laban, what have I done that's so bad? I've took what I've worked for. I've taken my wives and my children. We're going home. What's so bad about that? Whereas thou hast searched all my stuff, what hast thou found of all thy household stuff? Set it here before my brethren and thy brethren, that they may judge betwixt us both. Whatever you found that you think belongs to you, just set it out here. Jacob's getting a little angry right here, it sounds like. In verse 38, he says, this 20 years have I been with you. Thy ewes and thy she-goats have not cast their young, and the rams of thy flock have I not eaten. That which was torn of beast I brought not unto thee. I bear the loss of it. Of my hand didst thou require it, whether stolen by day or stolen by night. I've taken care of your flocks. Your ewes. I took such good care of them that none of them miscarried. I've not eaten any of the rams of the flock. And I understand that a shepherd was allowed on certain occasions to take a ram out of the flock and slaughter it and eat it. But Jacob said, I've not done that. He said, when the beasts came around, the animals, and they killed a sheep or a goat. He said, I didn't bring it to you. I bear the loss of it. I paid for it because you required it at my hand. Whether it was stolen by day or stolen by night, you made me pay for them. Thus I was in the day the drought consumed me. I worked every day out in the hot sun and the frost by night. Many times he stayed out there with the sheep all night long and the frost upon him. And my sheep departed from mine eyes. Thus I have been 20 years in thy house. I served thee 14 years for thy 2 daughters, and 6 years for thy cattle. And thou hast changed my wages 10 times. You might wonder, how did he change his wages? Well, if their deal was that the speckled was all Jacob's, Laban would say, well, no, they're bearing too many sheep and too many offspring, so we're going to go with you get the streaked. And he just kept changing things like that, manipulating it so that he was getting the better end of the deal, he thought. You changed my wages 10 times. Now he's going to teach him something about God. Verse 42. Except the God of my father, the God of Abraham, and the fear of Isaac had been with me, surely thou had sent me away now empty. Laban, if it hadn't been for God, if it hadn't been for the fact that the fear of Isaac, my dad, your brother-in-law, if it hadn't been for those things, you'd have sent me away with nothing. You wouldn't have paid me anything. God has seen my affliction and the labor of my hands and rebuked you last night. Jacob had a pretty good spiritual understanding here of what God had said. And Jacob recognized the fact that God was looking down on him. God told him he'd keep him safe. God told him he'd bless him, and he did. And Jacob recognizes that, and he shares that with Laban. And you know, it's always a good thing when we're talking to lost people to share with them how good God has been to us, what he does in our life, and the blessings that we get from him. The world looks at us and sometimes they don't see much difference in our lives and their lives. As a matter of fact, they may be going after the big bucks and all those kind of things, and they say, well, I live a better life than you do. But they're missing out on the blessings that comes from God, that only God can give. They just don't know what they're missing. The night I got saved, I remember what I said to Francis. I said, my, what have I been missing? I didn't know what I'd been missing. But I know how the Lord has blessed me down through these years. Verse 43, Laban begins to answer. Laban answered and said unto Jacob, these daughters are my daughters. These children are my children. These cattle are my cattle, and all that thou seest is mine. Well, now, was he speaking the truth? But he made a deal, didn't he? He sold his daughters. He got 14 years of work out of them. He got 6 more years of work for the sheep and the goats and those kind of things. So it really, at one time they were his, but he traded them away. All that thou seest is mine. What can I do this day unto these my daughters, or unto their children which they have borne? Now Laban begins to soften up a little bit here. These are my children, my grandchildren. How could I hurt them? And he wants to make a deal. Now therefore come thou, let us make a covenant, I and thou, and let it be for a witness between me and thee. You know, it's a good thing when people are at odds with each other, if they can find middle ground somewhere and make an agreement to stop the arguing, to stop the fussing and the fighting and all those kind of things. But a lot of times, people just want to win. Whatever the cost, they want to win. But I think Laban's heart had got a little softer here because of his children and his grandchildren. And he recognized the fact that he may never see them again. So he offers up something here that they can both agree to. Let us make a covenant. A covenant is an agreement between 2 or more people. I and thou, and let it be for a witness between me and you. And Jacob took a stone and set it up for a pillar. Is this the first stone Jacob has set up? You remember when he was at Bethel? Or Bethel? He set a stone up there, didn't he? Jacob said to his brethren, gather stones. And they took stones and made a heap. And they did eat there upon the heap. When they made a covenant in those days, they sealed it with a meal. That was their agreement, that they would eat together. It was a sign of friendship, a sign of love for each other. I thought about the night before Jesus was crucified. He took a meal with his disciples. We call it the Lord's Supper. But there's a covenant there that he has made with us. Laban called it, I don't know if I can pronounce this, Jigar Saha Dutha. But Jacob called it Gilead. They both mean the same thing, the heap of witness. Laban was speaking in Arabic, Jacob in Hebrew. They make this agreement. Laban said, this heap is a witness between me and thee this day. Therefore was the name of it called Gilead. And Gilead, I've got Got a note somewhere if I can find it. And Mizpah means a beacon in the sense of a watchtower. This heap is a witness between me and thee this day. Therefore the name of it is called Gilead and Mizpah. For he said, the Lord watch between me and thee when we are absent one from another. Now that Mizpah, I learned something new about that today as I read one commentary. Most people take that as a good greeting when they're parting. May the Lord watch over you. And it can be that. But this commentator had a different idea, and I'll share it with you. I don't necessarily agree with him 100%. But he said what really they mean to each other is, the Lord watch over you. You're a crook, and I can't stick around to watch you. But the Lord's going to be watching you. Remember, Jacob and Laban were both deceivers. They deceived each other. And it could have been that exactly what they were saying. I can't be here to watch you, but you better watch out. God's looking at you. Now, I don't know if that's the true interpretation of that or not. But notice what he says there in verse 50. If thou shalt afflict my daughters, or if thou shalt take other wives beside my daughters, no man is with us, see? God is witness betwixt me and thee. When you read all of it, it's kind of what they're saying. I can't be here to watch over you, but God will be here. And Laban said to Jacob, behold this heap, behold this pillar which I have cast betwixt me and thee. This heap be witness, and this pillar be witness, that I will not pass over this heap to thee, and that thou shalt not pass over this heap and this pillar unto me for harm. That's their agreement. This is a place that we've met. We're marking the spot here. Jacob, I won't pass it coming into this land to get after you, and you don't pass it coming to my home. This is as far as we'll go. It's a witness. The God of Abraham and the God of Nahor. Now, is the God of Abraham and the God of Nahor the same God? Did Nahor worship Jehovah God? I believe if you search that out, he worshiped different gods. But what he's saying, the God of Abraham, that's Jacob's God. And the God of Nahor, that's his family. The God of Nahor, the God of their father, judged betwixt us. And Jacob sware by the fear of his father Isaac. Notice he didn't swear by God. He swore by the fear of his father Isaac. Then Jacob offered sacrifice upon the mount, called his brethren to eat bread, and they did eat bread, and tarried all night in the mount. They all spent the night there in that one place. And early in the morning Laban rose up, kissed his sons and his daughters, and blessed them. And Laban departed and returned to his place. So they've come to this agreement. They're parting. They won't pass that point to get to each other anymore. Jacob goes on his way. Laban goes back home. chapter 32 is one of the most exciting chapters I find in the book of Genesis. And as you study it well, because Jacob meets face to face with God, and it changes his life. He wrestles with God. There's so much in that we can apply to our own selves. So I invite you to spend some time in the coming week to study chapter 32. Any questions or comments that you have that you'd like to share with us tonight?
If I understood this right, Laban recognized that there was a God of Abraham,
Mm-hmm.
but he was not a believer.
True.
True.
True. Not a believer in the God of Abraham. He believed in his idol gods. That's what upset him so bad when they got gone. Anything else? We appreciate you being here tonight. And I trust that the rest of the week that you will be blessed in many ways, and that God will bring us all back in on the Lord's Day. And our worship time will be wonderful, our Sunday school, all those things. And continue to pray for souls to be saved into God's kingdom. Let's stand together tonight.